The last day of school had always been a mixture of relief and anticipation. For Mark and his friends, it was also the night of their annual camping trip in the woods behind the school. They had planned it meticulously, just as they had every year. But this year was different. It was their final year, their last hurrah before everyone went their separate ways. As the final bell rang, the students poured out of the building, their cheers echoing down the hallways. Mark met up with his friends, Lisa, Dave, and Sarah, in the parking lot. They piled into Dave's old SUV, their gear crammed into the back, and headed for the woods. The sun was setting as they reached their usual spot, a small clearing near a shallow creek. They set up their tents and started a fire, laughing and reminiscing about their years together. As night fell, the forest around them grew darker, the familiar sounds of nature creating a comforting background noise. They talked late into the night, sharing stories and dreams for the future. Around midnight, the conversation turned to the old school legend, the story of Mr. Thompson, a teacher who had disappeared decades ago. Rumor had it that he had gone mad and vanished into these very woods, never to be seen again. "Do you think it's true?" Sarah asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Dave shrugged. "Probably just a story to scare kids." "Still," Lisa added, "it does make you wonder." Mark, always the skeptic, laughed. "There's nothing out here but trees and animals. Let's not get spooked by ghost stories." As the fire burned low, they decided to call it a night. They retreated to their tents, the sounds of the forest now more pronounced in the quiet. Mark lay awake, staring at the tent ceiling. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. It wasn't the story of Mr. Thompson that bothered him. It was a sense of being watched. He told himself it was just his imagination, the result of too many ghost stories and too little sleep. Just as he was about to drift off, he heard it, a faint rustling outside his tent. He sat up, heart pounding, and listened. The sound grew louder, more deliberate. Mark grabbed his flashlight and unzipped the tent. "Who's there?" he called out, shining the beam into the darkness. The rustling stopped. He scanned the area, but there was nothing. He was about to head back inside when he heard a muffled scream. It was Lisa. Mark bolted towards her tent, flashlight shaking in his hand. He unzipped it and found Lisa sitting up, her eyes wide with fear. "Something's out there," she whispered. "I saw a shadow." Dave and Sarah emerged from their tents, equally on edge. "It's probably just an animal," Dave said, though he didn't sound convinced. They gathered around the dying fire, deciding to stay up together until morning. The minutes dragged by, each sound from the forest amplifying their anxiety. Suddenly, a loud crack echoed through the woods. They all jumped to their feet, hearts racing. "Stay together," Mark said, trying to keep his voice steady. "We need to see what that was." They moved cautiously, flashlights cutting through the darkness. The sound seemed to have come from deeper in the woods. As they pushed through the underbrush, they stumbled upon an old, dilapidated cabin. None of them had ever seen it before. "Is this Mr. Thompson's?" Sarah whispered, her voice trembling. "Let's just look inside and then get out of here," Mark said. They approached the cabin, its door hanging ajar. Mark pushed it open, and the smell of decay hit them. Inside, the cabin was a mess. Papers and books were scattered everywhere, and the furniture was covered in dust. In the corner, they found a desk with an old, leather-bound journal. Mark picked it up and flipped through the pages. The last entry was dated 40 years ago. "It's his journal," Mark said. "Listen to this. I can't escape the eyes in the woods. They're always watching. I hear them at night, whispering my name. I know I'm not alone here." A cold chill ran down their spines. Suddenly the door slammed shut, and they were plunged into darkness. Mark fumbled with his flashlight, but it wouldn't turn on. Panic set in as they realized they were trapped. They heard the rustling again, this time all around them. It was as if the forest had come alive, closing in on the cabin. The whispers grew louder, indistinguishable, yet hauntingly familiar. Mark's heart pounded in his chest as he tried to think of a way out. Then, as quickly as it started, the noise stopped. The door creaked open, and they bolted out, running back to their campsite. They didn't stop until they were safely inside the SUV, the engine roaring to life as they sped away from the woods. As they reached the safety of the main road, they breathed a collective sigh of relief. No one spoke. The weight of what had happened was too much to process. They knew they had encountered something beyond explanation, something that had been waiting in the woods for far too long. The next morning, they returned to school, the final day of their senior year. But something had changed. The carefree excitement was gone, replaced by a lingering unease. They never spoke of the night in the woods again, each of them carrying the memory like a shadow, a reminder that some stories are better left untold. In the small town of New Hope, the last day of school was always a cause for celebration. Summer break was on the horizon, and students eagerly looked forward to the long, carefree days ahead. For the graduating seniors at New Hope High, it was a bittersweet farewell to their childhood and a step into the unknown future. 17-year-old Claire and her friends, Sam, Jess, and Mike, had planned to make their last day unforgettable. After the final bell rang, they decided to explore the old, abandoned school building on the outskirts of town. The building had been closed for decades, shrouded in mystery and local legends. It was said to be haunted, but the group dismissed the stories as mere folklore. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the town, the four friends gathered at the gates of the old school. The building loomed before them, its windows broken and ivy creeping up its walls. The air was thick with the scent of decay and the eerie silence of a place long forgotten. "Are we really doing this?" Jess asked, her voice tinged with nervous excitement. Come on, it'll be fun," Mike replied with a grin. "Besides, it's our last day. We need to go out with a bang." With a mixture of apprehension and curiosity, they pushed open the creaky gates and made their way inside. The halls were dark and dusty, littered with remnants of the past, old desks, faded posters, and broken lockers. The atmosphere was oppressive, and every sound seemed to echo ominously. They walked cautiously through the corridors, their flashlights casting eerie beams of light. As they ventured deeper into the building, they stumbled upon a large, dimly lit room. In the center stood an old, rusted clock, its hands frozen at midnight. "Look at this," Claire said, pointing to the clock. "It's so creepy." "Yeah, but kind of cool too," Sam added, snapping a photo with his phone. Suddenly, they heard a faint rustling sound, like distant footsteps. They exchanged uneasy glances, but decided to follow the sound, driven by a mix of fear and curiosity. The footsteps led them to a locked door at the end of a hallway. The door was old and wooden, with strange symbols carved into its surface. "Do you think we should open it?" Jess asked, her voice trembling. "We've come this far," Mike said, trying to sound brave. "Let's see what's inside." Using a hairpin, Claire managed to pick the lock, and the door creaked open. Inside was a small room, dimly lit by a single flickering light bulb. The walls were covered in more of the strange symbols, and in the center of the room was an old, dusty book. Sam picked up the book and began to flip through its pages. "This looks like some kind of journal," he said. "It's full of weird drawings and notes." As they examined the book, the rustling grew louder and more distinct. They could now make out what sounded like whispers, fragmented and eerie. "Guys, I don't think we should be here," Claire said, her voice quivering. "This is starting to feel really wrong." Before they could react, the door slammed shut behind them, and the light bulb flickered out, plunging them into darkness. Panic set in as they fumbled with their flashlights. The whispers turned into anguished cries, and a cold, oppressive presence filled the room. They felt unseen hands brushing against them, pulling at their clothes, and whispering in their ears. "Let's get out of here!" Mike shouted, banging on the door. But the door wouldn't budge. It was as if the room itself was holding them captive. The air grew colder and the cries grew louder, echoing in their minds. Desperate, Sam opened the journal and began to read aloud from it, hoping to find something that could help them. As he read, the cries intensified, and they felt a growing sense of dread. In a final act of desperation, Claire grabbed the book and tore out a page with a strange incantation. She read the words aloud, her voice shaking. The room seemed to convulse, and the cries turned into a deafening roar. The light suddenly came back on, and the door creaked open. The friends, now terrified, bolted from the room and ran through the darkened halls, stumbling over debris and old furniture. This time, they didn't stop until they were outside, gasping for breath. They made their way back to town, shaken and silent. When they finally spoke, it was only to agree that they would never speak of that night again. They moved on with their lives, each carrying the memory of the old school and the terrifying experience they had shared. New Hope High remained abandoned, its dark secrets hidden within its walls. Some mysteries, they had learned, were better left unsolved, and some places were better left undisturbed. The last day of school was supposed to be a time of joy and celebration, but for Claire, Sam, Jess, and Mike, it became a night they would never forget. The final bell of the school year rang, and a wave of cheers erupted through the hallways. Students spilled out of classrooms, their faces lit with the excitement of summer freedom. Among them was Jake, a senior who had been looking forward to this day for weeks. His best friends, Mia, Ben, and Sophie, had planned a celebratory evening at their usual hangout spot, an old abandoned factory on the outskirts of town. The factory had long been a favorite spot for them. It was a relic of the town's industrial past, now overgrown and forgotten. They liked the solitude and the sense of adventure it provided. As the sun set, they made their way there, carrying snacks, drinks, and a speaker for music. The factory loomed ahead, a dark silhouette against the twilight sky. They slipped through a gap in the chain-link fence and made their way inside. The interior was as they remembered, dusty with remnants of machinery scattered about. They set up in the main hall, the high ceiling and broken windows giving it a cathedral-like atmosphere. As the night deepened, they laughed and reminisced about their school years. The factory echoed with their voices, a stark contrast to its usual silence. Jake noticed Mia seemed quieter than usual, but he brushed it off, assuming she was just tired. Around midnight, they decided to explore a bit. They had been in the factory many times, but it was a tradition to wander through its darkened corridors, flashlights in hand. They split into pairs, Jake and Mia heading one way, Ben and Sophie another. Jake and Mia walked through the vast empty rooms, their footsteps echoing. They reached an area they had never ventured into before, a section of the factory that had been cordoned off, presumably for safety reasons. The barrier had long since fallen, and curiosity got the better of them. "Let's check it out," Jake said, his flashlight illuminating the dusty path ahead. Mia hesitated. "Are you sure? It doesn't look safe." "Just a quick look," Jake insisted. "We'll be careful." They stepped over the fallen barrier and ventured deeper into the factory. The air grew cooler, and the shadows seemed to stretch and twist. They reached a room filled with old lockers, some hanging open, revealing rusted tools and forgotten personal items. As Jake rummaged through one of the lockers, Mia stood by the doorway, her flashlight casting nervous glances around the room. Suddenly, they heard a loud crash from the direction they had come. They both jumped, their flashlights shaking. "Ben? Sophie?" Jake called out, but there was no response. "Maybe we should go back," Mia suggested, her voice trembling. "Yeah, let's go," Jake agreed, his sense of adventure quickly fading. They retraced their steps, but as they approached the main hall, they noticed something strange. The door they had come through was closed. Jake pushed on it, but it wouldn't budge. Panic set in as they realized they were trapped. "What's going on?" Mia cried, her eyes wide with fear. Jake tried to stay calm. "Let's find another way out." They backtracked, looking for an alternative exit, but the factory seemed to twist and turn, each corridor looking more unfamiliar than the last. Their flashlights flickered, casting eerie shadows on the walls. Suddenly, they heard footsteps behind them. They turned, but saw nothing. The footsteps grew louder, closer, as if someone or something was following them. "Run!" Jake shouted, grabbing Mia's hand. They sprinted through the maze of corridors, their breath coming in ragged gasps. The footsteps pursued them, relentless and terrifying. They burst into a large room filled with old machinery. Jake spotted a ladder leading to a skylight. "Up there!" he yelled. They scrambled up the ladder, pushing the skylight open and climbing out onto the factory roof. The cool night air hit their faces as they collapsed, gasping for breath. From their vantage point, they could see Ben and Sophie running towards the SUV, which they had parked nearby. They had clearly heard the commotion and were ready to leave. Jake and Mia climbed down and ran to their friends. Without a word, they all piled into the SUV and drove away, the factory growing smaller in the rearview mirror. As they reached the safety of the town, they pulled over to catch their breath. No one spoke for a long moment, the adrenaline still coursing through their veins. "What the hell happened in there?" Ben finally asked, breaking the silence. Jake shook his head. "I don't know, but I'm never going back there again." They agreed. The sense of adventure now replaced with a sober realization. The factory, once their playground, had turned into something else entirely. The last day of school had become a night they would never forget, a reminder that some places are best left undisturbed, their secrets buried in the shadows. Like the video if you enjoyed, and subscribe for more horror stories.